My name is Oscar Adams. I'm 41 years old. I live just outside Seattle, in a house most people would call impressive, and I once called safe. If you met me at a neighborhood gathering, you'd probably describe me as steady, calm, the reliable one. I run a mid-sized logistics firm that I built from the ground up over 15 years. I don't raise my voice. I don't posture. I don't dominate conversations. I listen more than I speak, and because of that, people tend to underestimate me. They mistake composure for passivity, silence for ignorance, kindness for incapacity. I've been underestimating my entire life. Teachers thought I lacked ambition. Colleagues assumed I wasn't competitive. Even extended family sometimes describe me as lucky instead of disciplined. I never corrected them. There's a certain freedom in letting people misunderstand you, but none of that prepared me for what I would see on a quiet Tuesday night, sitting alone in my home office, staring at footage from a small camera I had secretly installed in my own living room. I had hired a driver 3 months earlier, a temporary arrangement, or so I thought. My schedule had become demanding, and my wife had mentioned feeling overwhelmed with errands and appointments. I brought him into our lives personally. I shook his hand. I trusted him with our keys. What I saw in that footage was not loud, not dramatic, not cinematic. It was worse. It was ours intimate, measured, familiar, the kind of closeness that doesn't happen accidentally. The footage revealed a betrayal unfolding inside my own home, with someone I had personally brought into our lives. This isn't a story about rage. It isn't about revenge. It isn't about public humiliation or dramatic confrontations. It's about something much quieter. It's about the slow realization that the role you've been playing in your own life was assigned to you by people who mistook your restraint for weakness. It's about what happens when a man stops arguing and starts observing. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through who I was to them, how small dismissals accumulate, how silence can become strategy, and what happens when clarity replaces emotion. There were no shattered plates, no screaming matches, no midnight departures with suitcases. There was only one decision, and once I made it, nothing in that house belonged to the same reality anymore. I won't dramatize this. I won't exaggerate it. I'll tell you exactly what happened, and more importantly, how I changed because of it. Because sometimes the most powerful shift in a life isn't visible to anyone else. It happens in stillness. Tell me, have you ever been seen as safe when you were actually capable of far more than anyone realized? If you asked my wife to describe me 3 months ago, she would have smiled first. That's important. She would have smiled before answering. Then she would have said something like, "Oscar, he's dependable. He takes care of everything." To most people, that sounds like praise. And maybe it is. But listen closely to the tone people use when they describe someone as dependable. There's comfort in it, safety, predictability, not mystery, not tension, not a threat. I was the man who handled the mortgage without being asked. The man who renewed insurance policies early. The man who fixed the loose cabinet hinge before anyone noticed it was loose. I knew the Wi-Fi password, the accountant's direct number, and the plumber's schedule. I knew which drawer the spare batteries were in. I was infrastructure, necessary, invisible, expected. At dinner parties, I was the listener. When my wife told stories, I nodded. When her friends joked about husbands who forgot anniversaries or avoided errands, she would lightly squeeze my hand and say, "Oscar's not like that." And she was right. I wasn't. But somewhere along the way, "not like that" quietly turned into "not exciting." Not reactive. Not urgent. I noticed small things long before the camera ever existed. The way conversations continued over me instead of with me. The way decisions were announced instead of being discussed. The way gratitude slowly shifted into assumption. When we hired Daniel, the driver, I was the one who interviewed him. 32 years old, polished, confident without being aggressive. Former private chauffeur for a tech executive relocating overseas. Clean record. Excellent references. My wife liked that he was easy to talk to. I liked that he was punctual. The first few weeks were normal. He drove her to appointments, events, and lunches. Sometimes to the gym. Sometimes nowhere specific, just errands. I paid him well. Above market. Loyalty, in my mind, was built through respect. But gradually, something subtle changed in the atmosphere at home. My wife started mentioning his observations. Daniel says traffic's getting worse near the marina. Daniel thinks that the new cafe downtown is overrated. Daniel told the funniest story today. It wasn't jealousy. Not yet. It was displacement. There's a specific feeling when your presence in a room becomes optional. When your contribution is practical, but not sought. When you're valued for stability. but not for depth. I remember one evening in particular. We were in the living room. She was scrolling through her phone, smiling at something. "What's funny?" I asked. "Oh, nothing. Daniel just sent a meme about how bad my parallel parking is. A joke. Harmless. Except she hadn't mentioned struggling to park. Not to me." I nodded, smiled faintly, said nothing. Because that's who I was to them. The calm one. The one who wouldn't overreact. The one who trusted easily. The one who didn't need reassurance. They never saw the difference between quiet and unaware. And never corrected them. Because being underestimated has one extraordinary advantage. No one prepares for you. The first real cut wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on a collar. No late-night excuses. No suspicious perfume lingering in the air. It was smaller than that. And somehow that made it sharper. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. I had just finished reviewing quarterly projections in my office upstairs. Numbers have always grounded me. They're honest. If something shifts, there's a reason. A line item explains it. Human behavior is rarely that generous. I came downstairs earlier than usual. The house was quiet, but not empty. I could hear low voices drifting in from the kitchen. Light, familiar, comfortable. My wife was laughing, not her polite social laugh. Not the one she uses at charity events or dinners. The unguarded one, the one she used to have with me. I stepped into the kitchen doorway and saw them standing closer than necessary. Not touching, just close enough that it would have been awkward for a third person to enter. Which I did. They separated instinctively, not dramatically, just a half step each, like magnets subtly pushed apart. "Hey," I said. Daniel straightened slightly. "Good afternoon, sir." Sir. He had always called me sir, respectful, clean. My wife smiled. "You're done working already?" Already. There was something in that word, as if my presence disrupted a flow that had been uninterrupted. "Earlier than expected," I replied. I noticed the countertop between them. My wife's phone was face down. Daniel's keys were resting beside it. 2 glasses of sparkling water, both half finished. It looked innocent. It probably was, in isolation. But isolation is rarely where truth lives. "We were just talking about Napa," she said casually. "Daniel's been there. He says we should plan a trip." I hadn't been the part of that conversation. "Oh?" I said. "Yeah," Daniel added smoothly. "There's this vineyard that does private tastings. You'd like it." "You'd like it." He spoke as though he knew my tastes. I studied him for half a second longer than necessary. Calmly. Not confrontational, just observing. He held eye contact. Confident men don't avoid eye contact, but neither do men who believe they're untouchable. The moment passed. I poured myself a glass of water. The conversation dissolved into logistical small talk. Within minutes, Daniel excused himself to prep the car. When the door closed, I asked lightly, "You two seem to get along well." She shrugged. "He's easy to talk to. You're always so busy." There it was. A small statement. Not cruel, not loud, but weighted. "You're always so busy." Translated, it meant, he has time. And time is intimacy's quiet currency. I could have challenged it. Could have defended myself. Listed the hours I spend building the life we live in. Instead, I nodded. "I'll try to free up more weekends," I said. She smiled appreciatively. "That would be nice." That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not because I believed she was cheating, but because I felt something shifting in the architecture of our marriage. It wasn't about attraction. It wasn't about romance. It was about proximity, emotional access, shared micro-moments I wasn't part of. And what unsettled me most wasn't what I saw in that kitchen. It was what neither of them seemed worried about me seeing. No fluster, no guilt, no guarded tension. Just comfort. That was the first small cut. Small enough for everyone else to ignore. Precise enough that I couldn't. If something hurts once, you react. If it happens twice, you question yourself. If it happens consistently, you begin to normalize it. That's how subtle disrespect survives. Not through aggression, but through repetition. After that afternoon in the kitchen, nothing obvious changed. No sudden secrecy, no dramatic shifts in behavior. In fact, everything looked even more normal. That was the problem. Daniel's presence became routine. His car is pulling into the driveway at 8:15 sharp. The faint sound of my wife's heels crossing the hardwood floor as she left for the day. The low murmur of conversation as they walked out together. Sometimes I would be on a conference call upstairs and catch fragments drifting through an open window, her voice lighter than usual. Animated. I told myself I was imagining patterns. One Tuesday evening, we were having dinner, just the two of us. Daniel had already left for the day. She was describing a lunch she'd had downtown. "And Daniel found parking in seconds," she said. You know how impossible that area is. I smiled faintly. He's good at what he does. He really is, she agreed, a little too warmly. Then, almost casually, he actually suggested that new Thai place you like. Said it reminded him of something you'd order. I paused mid-bite. Suggested something I'd order. When had my preferences become discussion topics between them? I kept my voice even. You two talk about me often, she laughed. Oh my God, Oscar, not like that. You're being dramatic. Dramatic. The word landed softly, but it reframed the moment. Suddenly, my observation wasn't valid. It was an overreaction. Because I'm not a reactive man, I withdrew instead of pushing. I was just asking. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. You worry too much. I didn't correct her, because the truth was, I wasn't worried. I was cataloguing. That's the thing about being underestimated. People assume you aren't tracking data, but I track everything. The frequency of his name in conversation increased. Small inside references appeared. Oh, that's what Daniel says too. You sound just like him about that. Daniel thinks it was never romantic, never inappropriate, just comparative. And comparisons are erosion. One evening, I walked into the living room to find them both reviewing something on her phone. Their shoulders almost touch. They didn't jump apart. They didn't need to. Look at this, she said, tilting the phone toward me. Daniel says this is the best route to avoid Friday traffic. I glanced at the screen. Smart, I said. Daniel smiled. Just trying to make life easier. Make life easier. I studied that phrase later in my office. That's what I'd built my entire identity around, making life easier. And now someone else was being thanked for it, out loud. Was it an affair? No, not yet. But emotional displacement doesn't start with hotel rooms. It starts with relevance shifting, with laughter redistributed, with micro-loyalties forming in spaces you once occupied effortlessly. And what unsettled me most wasn't her behavior. It was mine. I kept choosing silence, not out of fear, not out of denial, but because confronting something intangible feels foolish. There's no evidence to point to, only intuition. And intuition, in a calm man, looks like paranoia. So I rationalized. She's lonely during the day. He's available. It's harmless. You're overthinking. But late at night, when the house was still, and the refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, one thought returned with uncomfortable clarity. If nothing inappropriate is happening, why does it feel like I'm slowly being replaced in conversations that used to belong to me? Disrespect rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly. And if you don't address it early, it begins to feel normal. By the end of that month, I had stopped questioning it aloud, which was exactly what they expected me to do, because I was predictable, measured, safe, invisible. But invisibility, when chosen intentionally, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a vantage point. There's a moment in every relationship when roles quietly solidify. Not through discussion, through repetition. By the time I noticed it clearly, I had already been living inside mine for years. I was the provider, the problem solver, the stabilizer of emotional weather. If tension appeared, I absorbed it. If something broke, I fixed it. If plans needed funding, I funded them. But somewhere along the way, I had also become something else. Predictable. Predictability feels safe until it becomes taken for granted. One evening, about 6 weeks after hiring Daniel, we hosted a small dinner at our house. 2 of her friends, their husbands. Casual wine, catered food, and low music. Daniel had stayed late to help coordinate pickups earlier that day. By the time guests arrived, he was gone. But he came up anyway. He's honestly been such a lifesaver, my wife said to her friend while refilling glasses. Oscar finally admitted he needed help. There was light lamnafadta around the table. I smiled politely. Finally admitted, as if asking for assistance was a flaw I had stubbornly resisted. One of the husbands clapped me lightly on the shoulder. Took you long enough, huh? I met his eyes calmly. Efficiency is about delegation. He laughed, but he didn't really hear me. The narrative had already been written. Oscar works too much. Oscar doesn't notice things. Oscar needs someone more present to fill in the emotional gaps. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't malicious. It was convenient. Later that night, after everyone left and the house was quiet again, I stood in the kitchen alone. I replayed fragments of conversation in my mind, not because they hurt, because they revealed something structural. In every story told that evening, I was referenced, not included. He's always buried in numbers. He doesn't even notice when I change the decor. He trusts me with everything. That last one lingered. He trusts me with everything. Trust, when repeated enough, becomes code for assumed compliance. And that's when it became clear to me. I wasn't just the provider. I was the emotional insurance policy, the man who would never explode, never accuse without proof, never create discomfort. Reliable, useful, non-threatening. It's a powerful role. It also makes it easy to underestimate. The next week, I overheard something that confirmed it. She was on the phone in the living room. I wasn't meant to hear it. Oscar. No, he wouldn't ever check. He's not that kind of person. Not that kind of person. She wasn't referring to anything specific. I don't think she was confessing anything. She was describing my temperament. And she was right. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't reactive. Which meant, in her mind, I was safe from asking dangerous questions. That night, I sat in my office and stared at the city lights outside my window. I wasn't angry. I was recalibrating. Because here's what people misunderstand about calm men. We don't lack intensity. We contain it. I began examining my role with clinical clarity. If I were the dependable one, if I were the one who trusted without question, if I were the one who would never check, then what assumptions were quietly forming behind that certainty? And more importantly, what would happen if one day I stopped playing that role? That question didn't frighten me. It focused me. Because once you understand the character others expect you to perform, you gain something extraordinary. Choice. And I was starting to realize my silence had never been weakness. It had been permission. And permission can be revoked. Quietly. Without warning. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after discovering a message. It didn't even happen because of something she said. It happened because of what I felt. And what I didn't. It was a Thursday evening. Rain against the windows. The kind of soft, steady Seattle rain that makes everything feel muted. I had come home earlier than usual, intentionally this time. No meetings, no calls, just observation. Daniel's car was already in the driveway. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the time. It was 7:40 p.m. He was scheduled to leave at 6. I didn't rush inside. I didn't check my phone. I simply walked through the front door quietly, the way I always do. Voices drifted from the living room. Low, close. There was music playing, something slow and ambient. I paused in the hallway, not to spy, but to orient. Then I stepped forward. They were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, not touching, but angled toward each other. The coffee table between them held 2 glasses of wine. My wife looked up first. "Oh, you're home." There was no panic in her voice, no scrambling. Daniel stood smoothly. "I was just about to head out, sir. Just about to." The phrase felt rehearsed. I nodded. "Long day?" My wife answered before he could. "Traffic was terrible earlier, so we waited it out." I looked at the rain outside the window. It had started an hour ago. Daniel collected his jacket calmly. "I'll see you tomorrow." Tomorrow. I watched him walk past me toward the door. He didn't avoid my eyes. He didn't challenge them either. The door closed. The house returned to silence. I turned to her. She looked relaxed, comfortable, slightly irritated that her evening had been interrupted, but not guilty. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. And in that moment, something inside me settled. Not because I had proof of betrayal, but because I recognized a pattern. They weren't afraid of being seen. They were confident in my predictability, confident that I would interpret everything generously, confident that I would not escalate ambiguity into confrontation. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt clear. Clarity is colder than anger. Anger demands a reaction. Clarity demands strategy. I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from her. "How often does he stay late?" I asked conversationally. She hesitated. "Not long enough for alarm, just long enough for awareness. Sometimes, if we're stuck somewhere." "And tonight, we were just talking." "About what?" I almost asked. Instead, I studied her face. She didn't look malicious. She looked unguarded, as if nothing about the situation required explanation. That was the shift. It wasn't about what she was doing. It was about what she believed she could do without consequence. I nodded once. "All right." That was all I said. But internally, something irreversible had begun. I went upstairs later that night and opened my laptop, not to check her messages, not to invade privacy, to review something else entirely. Our finances, asset structures, ownership distributions. Not because I was planning revenge, because I needed information. There's a difference. When trust begins to erode, emotion tempts you to react. But reaction exposes your hand. I wasn't ready to expose mine. As I closed my laptop near midnight, I glanced at my father's watch on my wrist. He used to say, "If you ever feel uncertain, don't speak. Study." So I stopped speaking. And began studying. That was the day something shifted. Not in our marriage. In me. Silence stopped being instinct. It became a decision. There's a difference between being quiet and choosing silence. Before, my calmness had been habitual. A personality trait. A way of moving through the world without friction. Now it was deliberate. Measured. Intentional. The morning after that rainy Thursday, I behaved exactly the same as always. I made coffee. reviewed emails, asked about her schedule, nodded when she mentioned Daniel would be picking her up at 10. Nothing in my tone shifted. And then that was the point. People prepare for conflict. They brace for accusations. They defend against suspicion. No one prepares for neutrality. Over the next 2 weeks, I said less, but I observed more. Daniel's schedule is occasionally extended, never excessively, just enough to blur lines. My wife's phone tilted away from me slightly more often when she smiled at it. Small things, not proof, but patterns. One evening, as she adjusted her earrings in the hallway mirror before heading out to dinner with friends, she asked casually, "Do you think this looks okay?" I looked up from my laptop. "You look nice," I said. She waited. There was something she expected. Maybe enthusiasm. Maybe reassurance layered with intensity. When it didn't come, she frowned slightly. "That's it. You asked if it looks okay. It does." She gave a short laugh. "You've been distant lately. Interesting. Silence is often interpreted as withdrawal. It's been a busy quarter," I replied evenly. She studied me for a second longer than usual. Not suspicious, just unsettled. The dynamic had shifted, but she couldn't articulate how, because I hadn't changed externally. I had simply stopped offering unguarded access. That's what people miss about emotional availability. It's a resource. And when you reduce supply without announcement, the absence is felt before it's understood. Daniel, on the other hand, grew subtly more comfortable. He lingered half a second longer in conversation, maintained steady eye contact, answered questions directed at my wife as if they were shared. It wasn't overt. It was confident. Confidence born from assumption. One afternoon, I walked into the garage as he was loading groceries from the car. "I can handle that," I said calmly. "No problem, sir. I've got it." Our hands briefly reached for the same bag. He didn't withdraw first. Neither did I. The moment stretched, polite on the surface. But under it, something else passed between us. Assessment. He believed I trusted him. He believed I was non-confrontational. He believed proximity to my life carried no risk. And I let him believe it. Because silence, when chosen strategically, reveals more than interrogation ever could. That weekend, I declined a dinner invitation she suggested. "I have some work to review," I said. She seemed surprised. "You never skip those." "I am this time." No argument followed. But later that night, I noticed something subtle. She checked her phone twice during a conversation with me. Not urgently, habitually. The redistribution of attention had become muscle memory. And here's the truth that settled in my chest like cold air. I no longer needed confirmation. I needed clarity. There's a moment when emotional discomfort crystallizes into a decision. Not a decision to explode, not a decision to accuse. A decision to stop being the least informed person in your own life. That night, I ordered something online. Small, discreet, high resolution. Not because I wanted a scandal. Because I wanted truth unfiltered by interpretation. Silence had stopped being passive. It had become preparation. And preparation, when done quietly, is invisible. To them, I was still the same man, measured, predictable, safe. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer hoping to be reassured. I was preparing to be certain. The camera arrived on a Monday, small, matte black, designed to blend into shadow. I didn't feel dramatic about opening the box. I didn't feel guilty either. I felt clinical. There's something sobering about preparing to test a reality you hope isn't true. A quiet part of you still wishes the evidence would vindicate your optimism. But hope is not a strategy. I installed it on Wednesday afternoon while the house was empty. Not hidden in a plant, not behind a painting. In the recessed corner above the living room bookshelf, angled wide enough to capture the couch, the coffee table, and the entryway. The living room had always been neutral territory. Open, casual, familiar. If boundaries were dissolving, they would dissolve there first. I synced the feed to a secure server, not my phone. Not something impulsive. Something controlled. Delayed access. Because this wasn't about catching someone. It was about understanding timing. Over the next week, I didn't check it. That's the part people don't understand. Restraint isn't weakness. It's discipline. Instead of staring at footage, I observed behavior in real time. Daniel's comfort deepened subtly. He began addressing my wife by her first name more frequently. It sounded natural, unforced. He lingered in conversation even when logistics were resolved. And she laughed more freely in his presence. Not flirtatiously, comfortably. That word again. Comfort. It's the most dangerous precursor to betrayal, because it convinces everyone involved that nothing harmful is happening. One Friday evening, I deliberately told her I'd be working late. "I'll be at the office until 9, I said. That wasn't a lie. I just didn't specify where my office was. At 7:12 p.m., I logged into the server from my laptop upstairs. The house was quiet. The feed loaded slowly. The image sharpened. The living room was empty at first, lamp on, music faintly in the background. Then the front door opened. She walked in first. Daniel followed. No rush, no urgency. He removed his jacket and draped it casually over the back of the dining chair. Not near the door, near the couch. That detail mattered. Familiarity breeds spatial ownership. They were talking. I couldn't hear the audio clearly, by design. This wasn't about dialogue, it was about body language. She poured 2 glasses of wine. He didn't hesitate to accept. They sat, closer than before, still not touching, but angled inward. Time passed. 5 minutes. 10. She leaned toward him to show him something on her phone. Their shoulders touched. Neither adjusted. The contact remained. There's a moment in human proximity when accidental touch becomes acknowledged, and then either corrected or sustained. It was sustained. My breathing didn't change. My pulse didn't spike. That's the part I remember most. I expected rage. Instead, I felt confirmation. At minute 14, she said something that made him laugh. She placed her hand briefly on his forearm. It lingered a second too long. That was it. Not a kiss. Not an embrace. Just intention revealed through comfort. Emotional intimacy had already crossed a line. Physicality was simply waiting for an opportunity. I closed the laptop. Not abruptly. Deliberately. Because what I had just seen wasn't devastation. It was data. And data eliminates confusion. They believed I was unaware. They believed proximity had no consequence. They believed the infrastructure of my life was solid enough to absorb any quiet erosion. What they never noticed was this. While they were growing comfortable in assumption, I was documenting, learning patterns, mapping behavior, preparing, not for confrontation, for leverage. The most powerful position in any betrayal isn't outrage. It's certain. And I now had it. The first night I saw it, I didn't watch the footage twice. I didn't zoom in. I didn't analyze frame by frame. I didn't sit in the dark replaying the moment her hand rested on his arm. That's what emotional men do when they're still hoping to reinterpret what they've seen. I wasn't hoping anymore. Over the next 10 days, I logged in only 3 times. Each time, I chose Ikaya carefully. Each time I saw enough. The second recording was shorter, a late afternoon. She arrived home early. He followed. There was less space between them this time. Less pretense. She didn't pour wine. She went straight to the couch. He sat beside her, not angled from the far cushion, but near enough that their knees aligned naturally. Conversation. Soft laughter. At minute 6, she leaned into him, not dramatically, just enough to rest against his shoulder. His hand hovered briefly at her waist before settling there. Not missing it. Tentative. Certain. That's when the shift was completed. There's a distinct psychological threshold between suspicion and reality. Suspicion is unstable. Reality is cold. Reality doesn't argue with you. It doesn't ask what you think. It simply exists. I closed the feed again. Still no anger. Still no shaking hands. Just clarity. What surprised me most wasn't their intimacy. It was their composure. No urgency. No anxiety. No checking the door repeatedly. They weren't acting like criminals. They were acting like people who believed they were safe. That belief was my leverage. Because leverage isn't about catching someone in the worst act. It's about understanding their confidence. Confidence reveals blind spots. And blind spots create opportunity. That night, I sat in my office and reviewed something far more significant than footage. Ownership structures. The house wasn't technically ours. It was held in a trust established years earlier for tax efficiency. I was the primary contributor. She was a listed beneficiary. The vehicles were leased under my company's fleet account. Her personal investment portfolio, funded entirely through distributions from my firm, Daniel, employed through a third-party agency I personally contracted. There's a quiet advantage to building your life methodically. You understand its architecture, and architecture determines consequence. I didn't smile when I realized this. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober, because now the decision in front of me wasn't emotional. It was structural. Continue pretending. Confront prematurely, or reposition entirely. The footage wasn't for court. It wasn't for humiliation. It was for certainty, and certainty removes hesitation. 3 nights later, I logged in again. This time they kissed, slowly, unhurried, no resistance. It lasted 7 seconds. 7 seconds is long enough to eliminate ambiguity forever. I watched without expression. Then I closed the laptop. There's a misconception that betrayal destroys you instantly. It doesn't. It reorganizes you. It forces a recalibration of identity. Who are you now that the illusion is gone? For me, the answer wasn't rage. It was always a restraint. Because once you possess private truth, you hold something rare, time. They believed I was still uninformed. They believed I would remain predictable. They believed proximity had no cost. And that belief gave me the most powerful position possible. Not the wounded husband, not the jealous man, but the informed architect. The reveal was private, silent, irreversible, and I understood something with chilling calm. The moment I decided to act, their comfort would collapse instantly. But until then, I would let them remain confident, because confidence makes people careless, and carelessness makes exits clean. Once you know the truth, the world doesn't explode. It quiets. The morning after I watched them kiss, I made coffee like I always do. Measured 2 spoons, waited for the machine to hum. Watched steam rise into the same kitchen where I had once overheard harmless laughter. She walked in 10 minutes later. "Morning," she said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. The same lips, the same warmth. Routine is a powerful disguise. "Morning," I replied. No accusation, no pause. If anything, I was gentler than usual. That's what certainty does. It removes the frantic need to confirm. Over the next few days, I ran scenarios in my head the way I evaluate business risk. Option 1, confront immediately, play the footage, demand explanation. It would be emotional, volatile, possibly cathartic, but it would also surrender control. They would shift into defense, into narrative construction, into damage limitation. Option 2, ignore it. Pretend not to know, allow it to fade. That wasn't discipline, that was denial. And I don't build companies or lives on denial. Option 3, separate first, speak later, quietly restructure my exposure, protect assets, adjust contracts, remove dependency. Then, when nothing irreversible could harm me, reveal awareness. Option 3 was irreversible, because once I began repositioning legally and financially, I would be acknowledging, internally, that the marriage, as it existed, was over. Not emotionally. Structurally, I spent 3 evenings reviewing documents with the same precision I use in acquisitions. The trust could be amended. The fleet account could be reassigned. Employment contracts could be terminated with notice and no allegation. Everything could be done lawfully, cleanly. No scandal, no illegal surveillance exposure, no public embarrassment, just a separation of architecture. The question wasn't whether I had the power, it was whether I was ready to accept the finality of using it. There's a quiet grief in that moment. Not grief for the affair, grief for the version of reality you once believed in. One night, I sat in the dark living room after she had gone to bed. I didn't turn on the lights. I looked at the couch, the coffee table, the space where they had sat, and I asked myself something simple. If she confessed tomorrow, would you still trust her? The answer arrived instantly. No, not because of the kiss, because of the comfort, because of the way they occupied space without fear. Trust doesn't break when someone makes a mistake. It breaks when they assume you'll never notice. That's when I made the decision. Not loudly, not with a declaration,
but with uplifting posture.
I opened my laptop, drafted an email to my attorney requesting a routine review of estate structures. Neutral language, professional tone, no emotion. Then I scheduled a meeting with our financial advisor, just me. After that, I typed a separate message to the driver's agency. We'll be discontinuing services at the end of the month. Please prepare transition paperwork. No explanation, no drama. I stared at the send button for a long moment. This was the point of no return. Once sent, the architecture would begin to change. She wouldn't notice immediately. He wouldn't suspect. But foundations would start shifting beneath their comfort. I pressed send. No surge of adrenaline, no trembling hands. Just stillness. The decision wasn't about punishing them. It was about reclaiming authorship of my life. Because the moment you possess certainty, the only real question left is this. Will you remain in a reality built on deception? Or will you quietly build a new one without asking permission? I chose to build, in silence. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. There's a strange calm that settles over you when emotion is no longer driving the outcome. I wasn't reacting to betrayal anymore. I was executing a transition plan. My attorney replied the next morning. Happy to review structures. Are there specific concerns? I kept it neutral, just ensuring asset protection and long-term flexibility. We scheduled a private meeting for Friday. At home, nothing changed. Daniel continued arriving at 8:15. She continued mentioning his name casually. Dinner conversations remained surface level. If anything, she seemed more relaxed around me. That's the irony. When you stop chasing reassurance, people assume you feel secure. The following week, I made 3 quiet adjustments. First, the trust. Years ago, for tax efficiency, the house had been placed in a revocable trust under my name, with her as beneficiary. Completely legal, common practice. Revocable means adjustable. With legal guidance, I restructured the beneficiary terms, not vindictively, strategically. Protections were inserted, conditions clarified, distribution rights narrowed, no alarms triggered, no notifications were sent to her directly. Paperwork moves slowly in the background of people's lives. Second, liquidity. I separated a portion of joint investment accounts into individually managed holdings. Again, fully within legal parameters. It required signatures, but not confrontation. Framed as portfolio optimization. She signed without reading deeply. She trusts me with everything. Her words echoed in my mind. Trust is powerful. So is complacency. Third, employment. The driver's agency confirmed termination effective in 2 weeks. Standard notice. No cause required. I instructed them not to inform him until the official date. I wanted the change to feel procedural, not personal. Throughout all of this, I remained calm at home. One evening, she asked, "You've been working with the lawyer again?" "Yes," I said. "Just reviewing estate planning." She nodded absently. "Good. That stuff stresses me out." "Of course it does. Infrastructure is invisible until it shifts." On the 10th day after sending the emails, I logged into the camera feed one final time. Not because I needed more evidence, because I needed closure. They were there again. Closer now. Fully intimate. No hesitation. It lasted longer this time. I watched without flinching. Then I deleted the recording. Not out of mercy. Out of principle. I didn't need archives. I needed clarity. And I already had it. By the end of the second week, the structural changes were nearly complete. Legally protected. Financially insulated. Emotionally resolved. And still, no one suspected. That's the power of moving in silence. There were no arguments in the house. No cold shoulders. No suspicious questions. She kissed me goodnight. He shook my hand every morning. Neither realized that the ground beneath them had already shifted. The most devastating consequences don't arrive with noise. They arrive with paperwork. And paperwork doesn't shout. It concludes, by the time the termination date approached, everything essential had been repositioned. Not vindictive. Not cruel. Just final. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing revelation. And revelation, when timed correctly, doesn't require volume. It requires certainty. They still believed I was predictable, safe, non-confrontational. They were right about one thing. I wouldn't explode. But they were wrong about the rest. Because while they were building comfort in secret, I was dismantling dependency in silence. And the consequences were about to begin, without either of them understanding why. The first consequence didn't look like punishment. It looked like an inconvenience. Daniel's termination email went out at 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday. Professional. Neutral. "Services no longer required beyond contracted period. We appreciate your support." No accusations. No explanation. At 9:27, my wife called me. "Did something happen with Daniel?" Her tone wasn't panicked. Confused. "I decided to restructure scheduling," I said calmly. "We won't need a driver moving forward." A pause. "But why? He's been great." "I'm aware." Another pause. Longer this time.
It feels.
Not really. It was always temporary. Silence on the line. I could hear the shift. Not anger yet. Disorientation. Routine had been removed without warning. That evening, Daniel arrived as usual, unaware. The agency had instructed him to complete the week. He greeted me the same way. "Morning, sir." "Morning." I held eye contact half a second longer than normal. He didn't flinch. Confidence still intact. That would change soon enough. Over the next 3 days, subtle fractures appeared. She became distracted, checked her phone more frequently, stepped outside once to take a call. I didn't follow. I didn't ask. On Thursday night, she finally said it. "I don't understand why you let him go without talking to me." We were in the kitchen, the same kitchen where the first small cut had happened. "I didn't realize I needed approval to end a contract I initiated," I replied evenly. Her jaw tightened slightly. "It's not about approval, it's about consideration." There it was. Not a concern for me, concern for disruption. "I considered long-term structure," I said. She exhaled sharply. "You're being cold." Cold. Interesting word. I wasn't cold. I was contained. Daniel's final day arrived quietly. He shook my hand. "Appreciate the opportunity, sir." "You're welcome." Our eyes met. This time, something flickered. Uncertainty. Not guilt. Uncertainty. Because confidence relies on stability. And stability had just been withdrawn. When he left, my wife stood by the window watching his car disappear down the street. She didn't cry, but she didn't move for a long time. That night she was distant. Not angry, yet. Disoriented. That's how consequences begin. Not with explosions, with absence. The following week, secondary effects surfaced. She asked about finances more than usual. "Did something change with the investment account?" "Minor restructuring," I said. "Why wasn't I told?" "You signed the paperwork." Her expression shifted. Not because I had trapped her, because she realized she hadn't been paying attention. Trust, once assumed, becomes exposure. And exposure feels like vulnerability. By the second week, tension had replaced comfort. Not because I accused, not because I revealed, but because the environment no longer felt predictable. She could sense something had moved, something foundational, but she didn't know what. That's the thing about quiet decisions. They echo before they're explained. One evening she asked directly, "Are you unhappy?" I looked at her carefully. "Yes," I said. No elaboration, no accusation, just truth. Her eyes widened slightly. "For how long?" "Long enough." But I didn't say that. "I've been thinking," I replied. Thinking is more unsettling than shouting. Shouting gives people something to fight. Thinking suggests a conclusion, and she was starting to feel it. The loss wasn't Daniel. Not yet. The loss was certain. The loss was control of the narrative. The loss was the comfortable belief that I would always remain predictable. Consequences had begun, and they were only structural so far. Emotional realization was still coming, and when it arrived, it would be too late to fix anything. Panic doesn't arrive loudly. It creeps in when patterns stop behaving the way they used to. By the third week after Daniel's departure, the house felt different, not tense, uncertain. She moved through rooms as if something might be explained if she looked closely enough. She asked more questions. "Why are we meeting with the financial advisor again? Why did the trust documents need updating? Why do you seem so, distant?" I answered every question, calmly, factually, without emotional layering. That unsettled her more than anger would have. One evening, she sat across from me at the dining table, hands folded. "Did I do something?" she asked. It wasn't theatrical. It was genuine, because here's what betrayal does to the person committing it. As long as it remains hidden, they believe control is intact. But once consequences begin without explanation, control evaporates. I studied her face. This was the moment most men chose confrontation. I didn't. Instead, I asked, "Do you feel like something changed?" She hesitated. "Yes." "What do you think changed?" Her breathing shifted slightly. "I don't know. You're somewhere else lately. Not defensive, not accusatory, just uneasy." She wasn't panicking about exposure. She was panicking about disconnection. And that distinction mattered. Because what she hadn't realized yet was this. The decision had already been made. You can't fix something that has structurally ended. 2 days later, she did something unexpected. She reached for me first, sat beside me on the couch, rested her head lightly on my shoulder, the same place she had once leaned into him. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. "We've been off," she whispered. "I miss us." Miss us. The phrase was sincere, and tragically late. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. "We've both changed," I said. She looked up at me, searching. "Changed how?" I paused. "Not for drama, for precision. I see things more clearly now." Her body stiffened almost imperceptibly. "What does that mean?"
It means clarity removes illusion.
Silence filled the room. Not explosive silence, weighted silence. For the first time, I saw something flicker across her face. Fear, not being caught, of losing stability, because she was beginning to sense what had happened without being told. The following morning, she called Daniel. I know because I saw his name flash on her phone when she left it on the kitchen counter. She took the call outside. When she returned, her expression was strained. "He's upset about losing the job," she said casually. "I imagine he is." She studied me carefully. "Did something happen between you two?" "No." That was the truth. Nothing had happened between us. Everything had happened between them. That night, she lay awake beside me longer than usual. I could feel it in the rhythm of her breathing. Regret doesn't appear as a confession. It appears as a recalculation. She was revisiting timelines in her head. Moments, conversations, trying to identify when the shift began. But she was solving the wrong equation. The shift didn't begin when she crossed a line. It began when I stopped being uninformed. And by the time she felt the ground moving beneath her, the architecture had already changed. Too late to renegotiate. Too late to apologize into reversal. Too late to re-enter a role that no longer existed. Panic, when it finally surfaced, wasn't loud. It was quiet, contained, just like me. The difference was, my containment was strong. Hers was fear. And fear arrives when consequences can no longer be postponed. The confrontation was coming, but not the way she expected. Not heated, not chaotic. Just final. I didn't choose a dramatic setting. No midnight wake-up. No thrown phone across the table. No printed screenshots waiting under a lamp. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Clear sky, quiet neighborhood. The kind of day that usually suggests stability. She was in the living room. The same living room, folding laundry. Ordinary movements, domestic rhythm. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Can we sit?" She looked up immediately. Something in my tone told her this wasn't casual. We sat across from each other. Not on the same couch cushion. Opposite ends. Deliberate space. "I know," I said. That was it. 2 words. She didn't ask what. Her face drained slightly of color. How long? She whispered. Long enough. Tears didn't fall immediately. They gathered first, suspended. You saw something? Yes. No elaboration. No description. Her breathing became shallow. I was going to tell you, she said quickly. I didn't challenge it. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she didn't. What were you going to tell me? I asked calmly. Her voice trembled. That it got out of hand. That it didn't mean anything. There it was. The standard minimization. It meant comfort, I said evenly. And comfort is not accidental. She covered her mouth with her hand. I never meant to hurt you. I believe that, I replied. And I did. Malice wasn't the driving force. Entitlement was. Assumption. The belief that I would remain unaware. Or forgiving. Or both. Why didn't you say something sooner? She asked, tears now falling freely. Why didn't you confront me? Because confrontation would have warned you. But I didn't say that. I needed clarity, I answered instead. She looked around the room as if the walls might hold evidence. Did you record us? The question was barely audible. Yes, she closed her eyes. Not in rage, in collapse. You watched? Yes. Silence expanded between us. Not violent, not explosive. Heavy. I ended it, she said suddenly. After he left, I swear. I nodded once. That was no longer relevant. Her head snapped up slightly. What does that mean?
The decision wasn't about him.
It never was. It was about trust architecture. And once that fractures, repair becomes theoretical. You're leaving me, she said softly. Not a question. An understanding. I've already begun separating our structures, I replied. We'll handle this respectfully, quietly. She stared at me as if seeing someone new. Who are you right now? She asked. The question wasn't an accusation. It was disbelief. I'm the same person, I said. Just informed. That's when the full realization settled in her expression. Not that I was angry. Not that I was devastated, but I was finished. And finished is harder to negotiate with than fury. I love you, she whispered. I loved what we were, I said gently. There's a difference. We sat there for several minutes without speaking. No shouting, no insults, no humiliation, just the sound of the house settling around us. She reached toward me instinctively. I didn't recoil. But I didn't take her hand. The confrontation didn't end with slammed doors. It ended with acknowledgement. I'm sorry, she said. I know, and I did. But an apology doesn't restore certainty. It doesn't unsee footage. It doesn't rebuild foundations quietly altered in confidence. As I stood to leave the room, she said one last thing. You were so calm. I paused. Calm doesn't mean unaware. Then I walked upstairs. Not triumphant. Not broken. Just clear. The storm she had expected never arrived, because the storm had already passed, silently, and taken the structure with it. People assume the aftermath of betrayal is loud. It isn't. It's administrative. Meetings. Signatures. Division of assets. Logistics about who stays where and for how long. Conversations about timing that sound almost corporate. We handled it quietly. No public spectacle. No social media fallout. No weaponizing of friends. From the outside, it looked like 2 adults making a mutual decision.
Only your son.
It wasn't mutual. It was initiated. By me. The house was sold 6 months later. Clean transaction. Profitable. Efficient. She moved into a downtown condo. Smaller. Modern. Independent. I relocated 20 minutes north into a property overlooking water instead of city streets. Intentional symbolism, maybe. But more than anything, it felt like breathing differently. The first night alone in the new house, I expected silence to feel heavy. It didn't. It felt honest. There were no shadows of suspicion in the corners. No quiet recalculations happening across a dinner table. No subtle glances at phones. Just space. And in that space, I met myself again. Not the provider, not the stabilizer, not the predictable husband. Just Oscar. I kept the watch. My father's omega still rests on my wrist every morning. It reminds me of something he once said that I misunderstood for years. Strength isn't loud, it's consistent. I used to think consistency meant endurance, staying, absorbing, being the dependable one. No matter what, now I understand consistency differently. It means maintaining your standards, even when it costs you comfort. I don't hate her. That surprises people when they hear the story. They expect bitterness, they expect contempt. But hatred ties you to the event. Indifference frees you from it. Do I miss parts of what we had? Yes, rituals, shared history, certain familiar silences. But I don't miss doubt. I don't miss being underestimated in my own life. The most important shift wasn't financial. It wasn't legal. It was internal. I no longer confuse calmness with tolerance. I no longer assume loyalty simply because I am loyal. and I no longer play roles assigned to me out of convenience. Since then, I've dated slowly, carefully, not suspiciously, just aware. When someone asks what I'm looking for, I don't say peace anymore. Peace without respect is fragile. Now I say clarity, mutual awareness, intentional presence. And if something feels misaligned, I address it early, not with volume, with precision. The man who installed a camera wasn't paranoid. He was reaching for the truth. The man who walked away without shouting wasn't weak. He was finished negotiating with illusion. Who am I now? Quieter, stronger, more selective, still calm, but no longer predictable. And most importantly, no longer invisible in my own story. If you've stayed with me this long, you probably expected something louder, a dramatic exposure, a humiliating reveal, a moment where anger finally erupts and everything burns down. That didn't happen, because this story was never about revenge. It was about awareness. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it enters quietly, through comfort, through familiarity, through the small belief that someone will never check. And strength doesn't always respond with noise. Sometimes strength responds with structure. The most powerful decision I made wasn't installing the camera. It wasn't terminating the contract. It wasn't restructuring assets. It was choosing clarity over denial, choosing dignity over drama, choosing to move in silence instead of arguing for respect that had already dissolved. Here's what I learned. If someone believes you will always stay calm, they may assume you will always stay. If someone mistakes your restraint for weakness, they will grow careless. But when you truly understand your own value, you don't need to shout to prove it. You simply adjust your presence. And when you adjust it fully, the consequences speak for themselves. I don't tell this story to encourage suspicion. I tell it to encourage awareness. If something feels misaligned in your life, don't ignore it just because reacting would feel uncomfortable. Don't explode. Don't accuse without clarity. But don't sleep inside the illusion either. Calm is powerful, but calm with certainty. That's transformation. So let me ask you something honest. If you discovered quiet betrayal in your own home, would you confront it immediately, or would you move in silence first? I'm curious how you see it. Tell me in the comments.